Hello chess friends and welcome to Jozarov chess channel and welcome back to the FIDE World Championship match between the two top grandmasters Ding Liren from China and Gukesh Dommaraju from India. We're now in the round 7 of this epic chess event. After the first 6 rounds the result was equal, 3 points for both sides, and I think now we have in front of us really the critical rounds. Who wins now one game, this could be already a huge advantage. If you lose one game, I think we have seen many draws, you have a tough time to get back into the event. So let's see now what happened in the round 7. It was a great game. I guarantee it was not a boring one. Put your seatbelts on, enjoy now in the really crazy game in a King's Indian attack. So with white, Gukesh opened with the move knight to f3. So I really loved here Gukesh's choice not to play e4 because it didn't work out for him, I think, in this event so far against Ding with the move e4. Ding is well prepared in the French defense, and we know that Ding won the first game with the black pieces in the French, and also in the last game that Gukesh played with white, it was, I think, a much better game for Ding. I think the only player who could go for a win was actually Ding, so it didn't even work out for Gukesh in any of this e4 opening. So now he played a Zuckertort opening, plays simply a different idea. We have now the move d5 here by Ding. We have the g3, the King's Indian attack, and now we have the double fianchetto here by Ding with the move g6. We have d4, bishop to g7, and now c4. This is I think already a very aggressive move. But if you're well prepared, I don't think that it's something special. Has been played many times, and Ding plays now a solid c6, fixes simply the structure in the center of the board, and now bishop to g2. What should black do now in this types of positions? So here you can play, of course, a more positional approach with knight to f6, or you can play, of course, also a more aggressive approach with d takes c4. If you play d takes c4, this wasn't playing the game, but I want you to demonstrate you, even if black goes into wild tactical lines, if you know what you're doing, still pretty equalish lines exist, I think, in this openings. For instance, you try castling, then knight to f6, then a4, the standard idea to prevent maybe the move b5. I don't know, then you can try to protect this pawn with bishop to e6, then white would probably attack it. So this line has been played many times. Bishop to d5, e4, then h6, a counterattack. So even in this line, I would say a completely equalish position. White eventually will get the pawn back here on c4, but of course white continues also the game with the bishop pair. Black continues the game with the powerful knight. In this particular line, I see one game in the database that ended with a draw. So I think black can take the pawn and white will eventually get the pawn back, but when the pace of the game slows down, then I think we can expect really simplified and equalish game. So that's why both players didn't want to immediately expose themselves. They really didn't want to show their cards. So that's why here also Ding played now a solid knight to f6 first of all, not exposing himself here in the center of the board. We have now castling by Gukesh, castling by Ding, and now after rook to e1, here Gukesh is preparing some lines like knight to d2 and e4 to really create more pressure against the center. And now Ding plays in move 7, already a theoretical novelty. Now he finally chooses to play d takes c4, and here e4 by Gukesh, of course, occupying the center, and now bishop to g4. Great move, I would say, here by Ding, because the knight is of course controlling here the d4 pawn. And now if, for instance, in any of these lines black puts more pressure against this pawn, this could be simply an object of black's attack. We have now knight from b to d2, and now comes, I think, the first critical moment of the game. Here Ding had, I think, a great positional chance already to be even slightly better. So d takes c4, I think Ding played in the right time, but the follow-up was not so great. Here he should have simply gone into this line with b5, and now after something like h3 you can step back, and for instance, if in any of these lines e5 happens, which of course Gukesh will probably not play, but I wanted to show you that you have always this defensive resource. You lock out the diagonal here for the light square bishop, and after something like, I don't know, knight to e4, you have always this resource, knight to a6, controlling the c5 score. So here black should be taking over, and I think this is an unpleasant game now suddenly for white. So b5 first of all has to be played. Of course, as I mentioned, Gukesh doesn't have to play this e5 stuff, but it's very, very hard now to compete. You have to play strange moves like a4, trying to, of course, to somehow disrupt this pawn chain on the queen side. Then a6 could happen, maybe, or some of this line. So this was the only way maybe for black to spice up the game. But Ding played c5, and this move is not so good, I would say, because first of all, what this move is doing is liberating here the long diagonal for the light square bishop. This is now a huge tactical problem. Gukesh advances now the pawn to d5. We have now the move e6, and now h3 here by Gukesh, forcing now reaction by the light square bishop. Although maybe a slightly better way here to proceed, and it's really a spectacular line, is to play the move knight to c4. For instance, the top engines are suggesting that you should go like this, and then after something like e takes d5, e takes d5, even if black takes out now the pawn on d5, you can still trade off the queens and then go for this line, knight to g5, attacking now the knight. And you see now the problems of the c5 move. I don't know, you can maybe try a knight to b4 counter-attack to maybe create a fork against both of these rooks, but then white will simply take the pawn on b7. You create your fork, you get your rook, but now after bishop to e4, here maybe when it comes to pawn structures, white should be better, because these are two obvious weaknesses. White pieces are well placed all over the board, so this was maybe a way to go here for Gukesh. But again, it's a too simplified maybe line, because the queens are off the board. Probably Gukesh has even calculated this line in his analysis, so that's why, okay, maybe you have something to attack, but it's again a too simplified way. So that's why for e6, Gukesh plays a more flexible variation. He plays now the move h3, bishop to f3, bishop takes f3, and now after e takes d5, we're reaching now this position where Gukesh has now the isolated d pawn, which could be an object, of course, of black's attack, but when it comes to maybe the later stage of the game, this could be also a pawn that bothers black, because it's a pass pawn. It is so far well protected, it is supported, and also the c4 pawn will be probably taken after a couple more moves. So this becomes now really an asymmetrical dynamic position with really opportunities now for both sides, because now here there is also something that white has to worry about, also the long diagonal of the dark square bishop. So what should you do now from black's perspective? You cannot pick up the pawn. That's now the issue, because knight to c4 will happen, and even if you try, I don't know, to disconnect the attack of the queen against the knight, then bishop to h6 is going to happen, and if you step back, then we simply pick up the rook, and then also afterwards the knight. So this line is not working if you don't want to, of course, lose any decisive material. So here after e takes d5, knight from b to d7, good move by Ding. He's trying, of course, also maybe to play the move knight to b6 and put more pressure against the pawn on d5, knight to c4, and now b5 here by Ding, knight to a3, we have queen to b6, and now bishop to f4. And I would say a really interesting position. White has this pawn, as we mentioned, the isolated pawn, but it can become not a weakness, it can become maybe the main strength of white's. The pawn is now supported even by the dark square bishop. If you in any of these lines push the pawn on d6, now it's even further protected. We can occupy maybe then the 7th rank. This knight is so far not well placed, but it could be, of course, useful if you reroute it, so white has enough time to somehow improve the position of the pieces. So it becomes now really crazy game, and we have to say it now, the light square bishop becomes simply the best minor piece on the board. We have now rook from f to e8, we have queen to d2, and both players have now finished their development. Both players have now the rook connection on the 1st and 8th rank. We have now rook from a to d8. Ding puts more pressure against this isolated pawn on d5, and now knight to c2, knight to f8. Ding clears now the attack for the rook against the pawn, and now comes, I would say, a very important moment of the game. Here Gukesh played an awesome move, b4, and this move seems like it's not doing so much, but it's a clarification on the queen side, where Gukesh is searching for simplification. He doesn't want to tolerate this 3 versus 2 situation, because Ding has maybe an advantage on the queen side, because he has a pawn majority there. So he forces him now to make a reaction here, because if you don't react, then also bishop to e3 could happen, and then it's really an unpleasant game. So what should you do now with the black pieces? If you try c takes b4, this wouldn't be good, because after knight to b4, a5, knight to c6 can be played, and suddenly the position is collapsing here. Rook to d1 is going to happen. The rook is already under fire on d8. Knight to e7 in some lines is an option if you don't react correctly. So here it's almost like completely winning here for white if black doesn't react correctly. So that's why after b4, Ding played now the move c4, which creates now also a very interesting pawn structure, which is now the so-called supported pass pawn. And I wanted to also demonstrate you what kind of a plan now black has. For instance, if we reach now this pawn structure, but without any minor pieces and without the queens, without the rooks on the board, if maybe the game goes into this position, then black should be winning because of the supported pass pawn. This is now completely winning endgame here for black. So when it comes to a potential fully endgame stage, black should be winning. But this is, of course, too far away from a potential endgame. So that's why here still the position is dynamic. Still many tactics can happen. But if Gukesh doesn't play aggressively now this position, if he allows somehow here Ding to defend, then this could be an unpleasant endgame for him. So here Gukesh continues with bishop to e3, an attack against the queen, queen to a6, bishop to d4. You cannot take, of course, knight to d5 again because of this tactics deflection of the defender of the knight. So this line is never working, so no one should be worried about this d5 pawn. But now if we move bishop to d4, what Ding did, he played now rook to e1, and now after rook to e1, what he should have done here now is to compete further with the move rook to e8. And rook to e8 is very important because after potential a3, protection of the pawn, you're trading off the pieces, and now you could maybe try later to play, I don't know, queen to c8, knight to e8, and create the blockade against the isolated pawn with knight to d6. This should be then, I would say, the main progressive plan for black. But what Ding did, he took the pawn, and it's sort of, I would say, dare to say, a poisoned pawn, because from this point on, here Gukesh has now the complete initiative all over the board. This was risky, too risky. I'm not saying this is a mistake or something, but it's too risky. And look at this, Ding had only 17 minutes on the clock. So now you're going into tactical battles without having so much time. And now from this point on, I would say Gukesh is taking over in the position. First of all, rook to a1, in order to maybe somehow spice up the game, you have to play a tricky c3. This would be the best defensive move, but this move is just suggested by top engines. I'm not sure how many of us would even consider this move. Then after something like bishop to c3, you continue with queen to c4. You still continue the pressure against this pawn on d5. Now bishop to f6. You have to take off, of course, the defender of pardon me, the attacker of the d5 pawn. You attack, simply trade off the bishop for a knight. Then you pick up this one, and then after knight to e6, this would be a line that could somehow bring Ding Liren into the game. Look at this, after a rook to a3, knight to g5, you attack the bishop, bishop to g2, and now you have this resource, knight to e4, here bishop to e4, queen to e4, and then after rook to d3. Okay, white is continuing the game with still an extra pawn, but now this bishop is very well placed. This could be a position that maybe black could hold and hope for a draw. But again, after rook to a1, what Ding did, he played now queen to b3, and this move is simply not so good because now white has a great attack. Here the Gukesh continues with rook to a3, simply an attack against the queen. Queen to b1, and you see now how the queen is misplaced on b1. Every piece of white is almost on the perfect square. These pawns on b5 and a7 are weaknesses till the end, so it's not so easy now anymore to play this game. This position is almost collapsing here for black. I'm not saying this completely winning, but it's really hard now to defend. And look at this, Ding still had only 17 minutes on the clock. After king g2 that Gukesh played, Ding continues, of course, here with the defense of the pawn. Gukesh, of course, goes for the pawn, and now after queen to b3, surprisingly or not, here Gukesh repeats moves, which is, I think, not a strategically good thing for him to do, because he is giving here Ding Liren extra moves, and we know that in move 40 you get additional time. We're now in move 27, so you see Gukesh has a much better time situation. Ding was already only on 15 minutes on the clock, so rook to a3 gives here again Ding Liren an extra move. Now again Gukesh is repeating, so maybe tiny little not good time management here by Gukesh. But okay, here after queen to b3, now finally Gukesh decides to play the move rook takes b5. We have queen to d3, and now here Ding hopes for the trades of queens. Queen to d3 is complicated, then c takes d3, and suddenly here also black creates an unpleasant pass pawn. So that's why Gukesh tried here queen to f4, trying of course to keep some kind of an attack against the knight. Also the c2 knight is hanging here. Maybe a slightly better approach was to play bishop to e3, allow then maybe the trades of queens, but then after knight to e8, that black would probably try to create the blockade. You can try bishop to e3, and then even this happens, rook to a5 keeps you in the game. This knight is well placed, it's not allowing any progress of this pawn. This pawn is a weakness. This knight is a little bit I would say overloaded to the defense of the position, so this was maybe a slightly better approach. But queen to f4 is also perfectly fine here, forcing a trades of pieces. Here for queen to c2, bishop to f6. Again, Ding is hoping to trade off the queens, because queen to bishop to f6 is not so good here. For queen to f6, queen to f5, then queen to d4 could happen, and now if this pawn is taken, then obviously it's game over then for black. So that's why again Ding is desperately trying to trade off the queens. Gukesh accepts now the challenge, queen to f5, g takes f5. Maybe again a slightly better approach is to play bishop to g5, keep the pieces on the board, and again go for this pawn. Gukesh traded it off, which is also still a better position for white, but now the game becomes a little bit more simplified. So I simply don't like when too many pieces are traded off. Now after bishop to g7, king to g7, rook to c5, and finally we see Gukesh intentions here. He is trying now to win an extra pawn, and now the pawn on c4 becomes of course a positional problem here for Ding. Knight to g6, Ding is battling. We have now rook to c4, knight to e5, and now rook to d4. You don't want to take, of course. Then after king to f3, this king will eventually get close enough. You'll never be able to attack it, and now white is waiting. White has the supported pass pawn with the rook, so this potential endgame should be completely winning here for white. So that's why after rook to d4, knight to c6 by Ding, Gukesh of course stays connected now to the pawn on b4. We have now knight to e7 in attack. We have now here the move b5, and after knight to d5, this wouldn't be good, because after rook to f5, here white would again win the pawn. It's again an unpleasant situation, so that's why after move b5, king to f6 has been played by Ding. Gukesh of course protects now the pawn. The issue is after king to e5, if you try to do this, then rook to h4 is going to happen, and suddenly you lose the pawn on h7. And we see now here after rook to d4, Ding was only on 4 minutes on the clock. Gukesh had slightly better time with 7 minutes on the clock. Ding plays now first of all the correct move, here h6. Gukesh continues of course with king to f1, and he's trying now to get closer with the king towards his pawn. Then he could of course play freely with the rook, but now comes the critical moment of the game, and that's what I meant. We're now in move 40, and now we know in move 40 players get additional half an hour with increment. Then the game starts to be played. Now after king to f1, what Ding played was now a huge endgame mistake. He played now the move king to e5, and this move is not so good, because again it's allowing here the move rook to h4 in attack against the pawn. In order to survive maybe this endgame, I'm not saying king to e5 is losing immediately or something, but now it becomes simply a one-way ticket in white's favor. A better choice was to play here knight to c8, here creating again the blockade against this pawn, and then after something like rook to c4, you play knight to d6, rook to c6, and then maybe with your king you can play here actively, and this is a position I think really that black could hold. But after king to f1, king to e5, this wasn't good. Now obviously the pawn on h6 becomes simply an object of white's attack. After king to e5, which was a mistake by Ding, of course, Gukesh goes with rook to h4, attacks now the pawn. You cannot even easily protect this pawn with knight to g8, because then white will simply change the attack towards this pawn, and then after knight to f6, you improve the position of the rook. Maybe black can go with this line, but then after king to g2, the issue is you cannot really pick up the pawn, because again, this one is hanging, and now after a couple of trades of pieces and rook to a6, this pawn is a huge problem. Again, I'm not saying, again, completely winning here for white, but white has a comfortable game. White would easily push this position, has always the opportunity to go forward with the king. Black's pawns are all over the place, so it's simply not working. So after rook to h4, Ding tried knight to d5, but now, of course, Gukesh takes the pawn also, so it's now a similar position. We have now knight to c3, rook to c6, and after king knight to e4, here Gukesh didn't find, I think, the best opportunity to immediately, I would say, close the game, sort of. Here he could have played immediately bishop to e4, simplifying the game till the end, and after bishop to e4, rook to c5. Even if this rook gets attacked, you play rook to f5, and after something like king to e6, you fix your rook with the move g4, and the rook is fixed. The rook is protecting this pawn, and you slowly but surely push this pawn, go forward with the king, and I think this would be a completely winning position here for white. But Gukesh played an inaccuracy with king to e1, which wasn't, again, a big deal, sort of. It's not a mistake that gives here too much chances for black, but here Gukesh shows that he's not really into this endgame. Here Ding plays, I think, the only moves that he could play in order to prolong the game with f6, h4 by Gukesh, although again maybe rook to a6, and then after knight to c5 to try something like this, rook to a1, rook to h1, and going with the rook behind. This bishop can be always useful in the protection of this pawn, so this pawn cannot even easily be attacked. So I think applying this Tarash rule, going with the rook behind, would be a good idea. But here after h4 immediately by Gukesh, rook to d3, and now comes another critical moment of the game. Here Gukesh, I think, allows Ding to get back into the game with the move bishop to d1, which simply wasn't good. Better choice was to play king to e2. You have to play forward with your king, because even if you get checked, king to e3 can happen, and even if, I don't know, knight to f2 happens, then you can pick up the rook. If rook to f2, then we pick up the piece, and also then the rook here. So black can never really pick up the pawn on f2. King to e2 was a crucial move here in order to stay somehow in the game. I think still a much better position for white. But bishop to d1 allows here Ding Liren to go forward with the pawn, and now it's an equal game. It's an equal position now without any complications. After g takes f4 and king to f4, Ding has gained equality. This is not a position that white can win anymore. After king takes a4, Gukesh continues with bishop to c2, an attack against both of these pieces, but it's simply not working here. Again, a new attack, but now with f5. Here Ding keeps everything good together, everything compact. Still, Gukesh is battling. He's trying, of course, to hold his extra pawn that he has on the board, but now king to f3. Good move, I would say, again, by Ding, simply activating the king, going for the f2 pawn. Again, Gukesh has to react, place a check, king to g2, rook to b3, and now we have rook to e5. Again, a good move by Ding, creating the maximum activity of the rook. Of course, there are also some tactical possibilities on the e file. We have f4. Gukesh pushes away the rook. Ding again connects now the rook to this pawn on a7, and now rook to e3. Good move, I would say, also here by Gukesh. But now after rook to h7, we have h5. Here with this move by Ding, Gukesh is pretty much forced to expose him, this pawn, and now here the Ding can, of course, put more pressure against this pawn. Gukesh goes not for the f5, but now after knight to h5 and rook to f5, now comes another tricky moment, I would say, of this game. Here many things could have gone wrong, but Ding played the correct choice. For instance, many of us would even try knight to g7, but after knight to g7, here actually white is winning, because after rook to g5 you have to play king to h3, and now after king to f2 white would build sort of a mating net. Even if you try attack to rook, then look at this, after rook to g1 there's nothing that can be done. You can maybe try to play something like this, but now after bishop to f1 there's simply no defense against a rook to h1. So it was also very, very tense here after rook to f5 that Ding played, but that Gukesh played, pardon me, and now Ding plays the correct choice, knight to g3, the only move that prolongs the game here for black. Great tactics that here Ding calculated, and you see the time was really here enormous for both sides. Both players didn't have so much time on the clock, especially Gukesh in one moment had even 2 seconds on the clock. And here after rook to f8 you cannot simply win this endgame. Here Gukesh is pretty much forced to play passively with his pieces, and the good part for Ding is here that the king is very active. Now after king to f3 that he played, Gukesh is again forced to push the pawns. Again Ding is chasing the pawn, now simply attacks it, and now after bishop to c2 now comes another, I would say, tiny little tricky moment here. If you take the pawn on b5, actually it's not drawish position anymore. Actually white is winning, because after here bishop to e4, king to e4 and f7, the issue is when you go with the rook behind, white would deliver a check and would simply push the pawn further. But again Ding plays the correct choice, knight to d6, we have an attack, king to e5. Look how close to the action is here, the black's king. We have bishop to b3, knight to f7, rook to d5 check, king to f6. Now of course rook to b6, trying of course to keep this rook out of game. We have now bishop to c4. Here Ding plays a good move again, forces now trades of rooks, which simplifies now the game till the end. And now he sacrificed of course even his knight, because you cannot just win the game of course with the bishop. Here he played a6, and after king to a6 in this particular position it was of course a thematic draw. You don't have enough material to win this game. So big chance for Gukesh. I think he missed a win here. Ding made this huge blunder in move 40, which allowed Gukesh to somehow make even a win, but unprecise play by Gukesh in the end costed him a whole point here. This could have been maybe even the decisive game. I'm not sure if Ding would have come back after this one if Gukesh won the game. So now I think Gukesh is under pressure, because I think he will have his thoughts about this game in the next couple of rounds. If he can back out of this, it will be now a very critical moment the next game when Ding is playing with the white pieces. So huge moment here for Gukesh, but unfortunately for the young player, he missed now his big chance against the world champion Ding Liren today in the round 7 of the FIDE World Chess Championship in 2024. So okay, great game it was. I think it was a spectacular game. Unfortunately for Gukesh fans, with not a good outcome for him today, but still with the draw he's in the game. Nothing he lost today, but it was a big chance, as I mentioned, in this round 7. So if you want to see some other great games that we have analyzed from this event, check out our Come to Chess Games. Here are some links that we have analyzed before, and if you like this content, hit the subscribe button. See you soon with some more videos, and what do we say in the end? Chess is the best, of course.